and work. So welcome, Diane. Again, introducing Michelle Cassandra Johnson. Thank you so much for being here with us. If you'd like to share a few words with the group that we have here, just like introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Ingrid, and thanks to everyone for being here. As Ingrid said, my name is Michelle Cassandra Johnson. My pronouns are she and her, and I live in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, which is Catawba, Cherokee, and Carolina Siouan land, and likely many other tribes as well. And I'm excited to be with y'all tonight to talk about finding refuge and how we respond to the grief we may feel or brokenheartedness that we may be feeling at this time. And Ingrid and I spoke about beginning with a practice just to settle into this space. So I'll guide us through a brief meditation, and then we'll dive into some conversation. So if you're in a place where you can find a comfortable way to be, that would be great. And if you want to close your eyes, you can close your eyes. You can soften your gaze, or you can find a grounding focal point in your space. And we'll take a moment to settle and center. I invite you to bring your awareness and attention to the breath and begin to feel your inhales and exhales. And as you bring your awareness to the breath, you might begin to deepen and lengthen the breath in your body, offering a longer breath in, longer breath out. As you deepen and lengthen your breath, take a moment to notice what is present. How are you showing up at this time, in this present moment? You might notice the physical body and physical sensations that are present. And you might notice any emotions moving through. And if there are thoughts, you can note the quality of the thoughts. And take a moment to notice how your spirit feels, however you think of spirit. And lastly, I invite you to bring your awareness and attention to the heart space, noticing what is present here. What are you holding in your heart, or what is present in your heart space? And you might notice different sensations or emotions as you connect with the heart. Perhaps there is some tenderness, joy, fear, courage, worry, assuredness. So just notice what is in your heart space and how your heart feels. And now I invite you to bring your awareness back to the breath. And take a few more deep inhales and exhales. And as you feel ready, if your eyes are closed, you can blink them open. Just taking a moment to reorient in your space and this space, coming back up to the surface. And thank you again for joining me tonight, for being here.
Thank you so much, Michelle. That was lovely. Thank you for the opening meditation. Well, to get things started, today we're discussing finding refuge, but Michelle is the author also of Skill in Action, which I had also read. So I'm not sure how many of you have read Skill in Action. This is it was a great experience to know that book and then step into finding refuge, because it's definitely a connection between the two. And speaking of creating healing spaces for people of color, reconnecting the body and the breath, and using yoga as that tool with people that haven't been part of the yoga community because of white supremacy, or because of um, uh, how our society is so used to working with yoga and certain cultures, certain races, certain identities. So thank you so much for bringing that awareness and bringing that healing within your practice and sharing it with others. The book, Finding Refuge, is actually a great reference when speaking about being true to the heart, being true to yourself, and understanding that it's okay to be aware of grief, and how to deal with it, in a way that is compassionate to you, that is compassionate to others. And thank you so much for this guide about exploring what grief is to you, because grief expresses in many different ways, and so forth. It was interesting to see this book. So, Michelle, did you write this book? When did you start writing Finding Refuge?
I wrote the introduction in the first and third chapter. The third chapter I thought was going to be the second chapter, but introduction, first and third chapter in probably February and March of 2020. And then the rest throughout COVID, and all of the other things, of course, that are happening in the world. But yeah, that was the backdrop for this book.
Yeah, it's so crazy that that you started this in March when the pandemic just started happening, and this is so connected to our collective grief situation of what the pandemic caused or what arose. So it made it much more also easier to read, because we're all going through this at the same time. Some have gone through grief before in their lives, but I think this was one of those crazy rare moments where we can all say we were very grief arose if it wasn't there, or it actually sparked grief that was there before that perhaps you weren't aware. So thank you for this and sharing that. One of the things I wanted to talk to you about was, we really don't talk about grief that often. It's mostly like a taboo. So even myself in this conversation, just talking about it, being vulnerable to the heart, and just being, also the word is compassionate, to your heart, is how how to really understand and be aware of yourself, how to bring that, which you spoke in the episode, in the chapter, of how the heart is overwhelmed with sensations and is a response, and its response to the nervous system. I think that during the pandemic there were so many things happening. We didn't have these the issues didn't all happen at once. They were already there. So it just awoken all these feelings, all these emotions, and became very, very overwhelming. Um, and one of the practices that you share in the beginning of the book is, you know, how grief does not change us, it reveals us. And that piece that you had a special practice on, a meditation for the heart. And it's really sitting with your own heart to really understand where you are at that moment. How are things making you feel? And at the end of the day, yes, there's all these crazy things happening. There's social injustices in the world. There's a toxic culture that we live in, institutional and cultural racism. And we have to heal ourselves in order to continue to live in this world. Can you share a little bit about that's a load of information I just shared right now. Can you share a little bit about how this journey came about really taking the time to heal that heart, to be deep in connection to that heart, because really that is the root of how you're going to heal yourself eventually and heal others, the community as a whole, by healing individually. How you started that journey.
Yeah. So your question really makes me think about how this book came about, or this um, idea that we would need a space to grieve and a process and some tools that would help us grieve and connect with the heart. And my answer to how this came about keeps changing. In so many ways, I think that grief chose me so that I could write this book, because each chapter in the book has it's a different story of grief. And then it's scaled to the collective. So it's the themes from my life and experiences, and then what are we experiencing in the world? And I think that, and you read Skill in Action, and there's a tiny bit about my birth story in Skill in Action. So I think the way that I came into the world set me up to write about grief. And of course, all of the injustices that I've written about in Skill in Action and Finding Refuge set me up to write and speak and hold space for the heart, and to steward spaces so we can talk about grief. So I think this came from many different spaces. And the first chapter in the book is about my mother. Her name is Clara, and she was sick in 2019, almost transitioned, almost passed away, and 2020, 2 different times. And I think, although I began to write the chapter about her when she was sick in 2019, and not knowing she'd be sick again in 2020 and sort of similar things would happen, I feel like that's concretized the need for me to explore grief, because what I understood as I was interacting with the healthcare system is that, you know, I've had negative experiences with the healthcare system because of systemic racism. My mother has as well. So I knew that going in, but also watching people be so disassociated from the heart and from their humanity, and how that then translated into my mother not being cared for, it really concretized, like, we need to talk about what we're doing to each other. And of course, Skill in Action talks about that in a way, and this talks about it in a different way, but they are linked. As you named, they're deeply connected. And it makes sense that this came after that, because there's this uncovering and consciousness raising that happens with Skill in Action. And then we're in the mess, we're in the grief, we're in the loss, we're in what are we going to do? And that's amplified at this time because of all that's going on. And so that's one of the reasons why, I mean, this book feels timely, but also the practices to help us. And, you know, related to the heart, I had a friend recently say, it's not just about having a good heart. And I was like, it's not just about having a good heart. You're right. And Finding Refuge is about what's going on in the heart. And it's not just about my heart, it's about your heart and everyone's hearts, you know, the hearts of others. That's what this is about. And it's really about touching into where there's brokenheartedness because of what's happening in the collective, and the ways in which the collective strips away our humanity or makes us forget who we are and how we want to show up in the world and how we need to show up in the world, and makes us forget our interconnectedness with one another and interdependence in so many ways, not just with other humans, but with all living beings and the planet. So I think it is deep work to engage in grief work. And I also think we're all grieving. It's just a matter of turning our attention toward the grief and the heart. I think grief is part of being alive. We are all going to lose someone, something, a person, a dream, a relationship. We're all going to experience anticipatory grief at some point. And of course, to your point, we are experiencing collective grief in a way that I've never experienced before because of a pandemic that is still very much alive and ravaging our lives in so many different ways. And the uncertainty that goes along with this time that we're alive right now, of not being able to plan and not knowing and anticipating, more loss and more people being sick, and just the ways in which we're not taking care of each other. I mean, that's also about the heart and not being connected to the heart as well. So it's not as grief is not separate from our human experience, and yet so many people have been conditioned to believe that it is. It is just part of being a human. Just like, my experience of feeling joy is part of being a human, and feeling confusion about what's going on right now, and experiencing loss, and then making space for myself to grieve and holding space for others. So that's some about the heart work, and the depth of what it means to work with the heart in the way I suggest in finding refuge.
No, that's very deep, because we talk about like heart and love and grief, but it's very superficial. So to really go inside and to really dig into asking those honest questions, like yoga is truth, what is the truth within you, really helps you grow, really helps you become more aware, and be present in those moments where you need it most. Personally, when I read the book, your story about your mom when she was sick, and you said that you were holding space for your heart and you were also holding space for her heart, but you were overwhelmed, your heart was aching. um, I personally felt that as well, because I had my father who was very sick, and he was diagnosed with stage 5 cancer in a very short period of time. And I come from, from a background of in my family where problems aren't spoken about really. So I was living a very happy-go-lucky life, and then this really crazy thing happens in my life that I don't know how emotionally to deal with it, and I don't know what grief means, or and so forth. So I learned it once I saw through the eyes of my father going through all that pain, all that. And he was going through his actual healing process during that time too, which actually opened up my eyes to see someone sick and someone that you love sick, suffer, and there's so much you can do. And at the same time, what you said about institutional racism is very valid also in our case, because I didn't know all these things that happen, you know when these experiences come to you. Like, is this normal? Do people treat patients like this? Is he just another number? Is it because he's so, like, he's older that it doesn't matter? When in my head I'm like, every single person, every single soul matters. So I would like him to be treated as well as anybody else who comes in here. So it was a lot of new things that I had not experienced, that honestly happened a very long time ago. And I didn't know how to address the heart. I know how I feel, but I didn't know how to hone in on it, how to bring awareness, and how to uh, not manage it, but how to care for myself and be compassionate for myself and just be expressive. And and it took a few years to actually slowly start opening up that heart. And I'm going to be honest, I was in 2014, so it was a while. And it was this pandemic that really, that was the break. That was the break that actually said, you have this baggage from that time, and this really kind of unleashed the sadness, the anger, the and not only of my father, but it also put it into perspective, because whether you had, put it in perspective of everything that falls within an institutional or social experience, like your job, your like your community, your even like yoga communities. Things I didn't notice was social or racism issues that I thought was okay, when really it's not. And I didn't see it until I started learning about yoga, until I really kind of understood a little bit about, okay, why am I pleasing everybody? Why is this so forth? And really what I'm feeling is very valid, and I should actually listen to myself to understand that. So your story about your mother when she was sick, your father, and how you feel about all these experiences in your life, it also it makes me realize that everybody has a different experience, a different story, a different identity. And it's really hard to be in communities where people don't um, understand that, or don't, or indifferent of it because they haven't experienced it for themselves, because they live they've lived a very different life. So thank you so much for that, because that, I wouldn't say the word is inspires, but it's just knowing someone else is going through this. It really sucks, but it just validates that you're not alone. There's more people feeling like this, and I'm just one story that I'm sharing, uh, but there's so many out there. Um, and how important it is to bring that home. And when it comes back to the pandemic and collective grief, which you mentioned, something else that was interesting in the book, and not to jump to another topic, is the how we're so much thinking about ourselves that we should be thinking about us as a community. Helping others is helping all of us. So I've learned that a lot along the way during this time, and it's been a journey on it. So again, I just want to thank you for sharing your story, because it takes courage too. People assume that yoga is all fun, is all like, not fun, but it's you have to be this perfect person, and it's not about it, because you're speaking your truth. And that's what yoga is. So thanking you as well for that. I don't know if anybody wants to share anything from their experiences on heart work at the moment.
I just wanted to say something before if people share and speak, which of course I want. Um, Earlier I said that, and you said it in different ways, we're all grieving. And what I named is, it's not a separate experience from being human. And so when I think about the people, and myself included, because I have power based on certain identities I embody, and that means that other people are being oppressed just because of the identities that I embody. So I think about people who are perpetuating oppression explicitly, or because of how they're positioned, their social location, and the trauma that they are creating for themselves and others. And I think they're grieving too. It just doesn't look like grief. It's like they're suffering too, and causing more suffering for others. And certainly implicated in these systems that cause harm. And it speaks to how grief looks different. And so when it's unattended is when I think it causes more grief and trauma, though. It's like when the nurse in the hospital with my mom had too many patients and was grieving not having enough resources and being tired and overworked, it meant my mother wasn't cared for. That's what I mean. There's grief there too. And it just, we may not call that grief, but that is from this space of suffering, right? And in a way, that nurse, multiple nurses not being seen or made visible in a larger system that was not designed to actually care for many of us, depending on our positionality. So I just wanted to name that too, because it shifts the way, and it's so much of part of finding refuge. Again, while it's my personal stories, it's like what's going on in the collective, and how are we connected as a community, which the chapter you're probably referencing when you spoke about that is chapter 6, which is about the honeybees and the hive and the collective, and how we can think about ourselves as, or remember we're part of a collective versus individuals moving along. And if we think of ourselves as the collective, then everything we do affects the collective. That's what I think, that is what finding refuge is calling people into. It's the deep heart work that reminds us of who we need to be to one another, who we must be to one another if we actually want to survive and thrive and shift what's going on. And so I wanted to name that before others share, just based on what you shared. You're muted, Ingrid.
Thank you. You can also feel free to share any questions or comments on the chat if you'd like, and I can share that as well. Michelle, the other thing in your book that you started off with is thanking your ancestors and bringing awareness to ancestry. How would you you share some practices of how to do that by reciprocating for your ancestors. Also, I believe it's that was one of them. The other one was acknowledging or celebrating spirituality. So for those that don't have perhaps the experience of their ancestors or knowing even their grandmothers, great-grandfathers, and so forth, you also brought up that our ancestors also the earth, and the earth is a healing mother, and therefore there's other ways that you can also feel connection with. That's my take on it. Another way that you can feel connection with ancestors through earth and nature. And you give some great examples of how we can connect to earth and nature by practicing. But have you had in your experiences students or other people share, how do I connect with my ancestors as I don't know exactly the history behind my story or my family?
Yeah, this question is coming up a lot. It has, I guess, over the last year and a half. And I think part of why people are asking about their ancestors in the spaces I'm in and how to connect with them is because in so many ways, the reckoning we're in the middle of is screaming, right? It's really loud, and it's calling us into changing the way we are and the ways we've spoken about. And I think the ancestors are, and the ways they're intertwined, and the ways in which we have not reckoned with history, which is connected to collective oppression, that's up for people in this way. That I've never heard the amount of people that are asking me now ask about ancestry. Like it is and more people are working with it, but I think it has to do with the time we're in. I think it's so, and the things we haven't paid attention to or healed. That's why I think people are asking about ancestors and wanting to know more about the story and how we came to be in this particular moment. And if you remember in Skill and Action, one of the first practices is where I'm from, right? It's this question of like, where do we come from? Which is a way of asking, like, how did we come to be in this moment? And how is our history, my own individual history and our collective history, connected with this particular moment, and how we're operating and acting toward one another. And ancestry is complicated. And so, people have a lot of feelings about ancestors. Some people feel pride about certain ancestors, and some people feel shame, and everything between pride and shame. And of course, there are ancestors in my experience that are not known to me. So I can only trace back. I know some about my lineage and where I'm from, but I can only trace back to a certain point based on the stories I've been told from ancestors in my life who've transitioned, and of course living ancestors like my mother, who can tell me stories about people in our lineage that I may have never met, that may have transitioned before I was born. And so, the earth that you mentioned, elemental energies are actually in some ways, if people are not comfortable working with ancestors, it's an entry point into working with ancestors, living ancestors, which are all around us in the natural world. And I also think it's a way to, I mean, the elements are affecting us and we're affecting them. So it's a way to practice that may feel easier than one calling in their great grandfather, for example. Like, it's depending on whatever trauma is there or whatever is going on. And so I think it's just a different way. And it's, if some of us do not know our lineage and we're practicing other practices like yoga, for example, myself, I need to be mindful of how I do it, because while there is a lineage of yoga from Africa, and I'm 80% West African, the lineage of yoga I learned is from India, and that is not where I'm from. So I think we also need to be mindful of the ancestral practices we're engaging in, or as we're searching out, like, who are our people, that we're mindful of things like appropriation and how practices have been commodified. The things that I talk about in Finding Refuge about ancestors, and it's in the chapter about my grandmother, Dorothy, which is really about, it's called Ushering Us. And it's really about what we need to do at this time, what our role is, how we show up. It's the story of her and of my experience of her transitioning, but also what she's calling us into, because she's the ancestor I feel the most, and I feel other ancestors as well. There are some guiding questions in the chapter to help people really contemplate and consider, how do I feel about my ancestors? What does ancestral support look like? So that happens before the practices. And what do people fear about connecting with their ancestors, so that people can be clear about it? And then some meditation on ancestral support and how to call that in, because I believe that healthy, or sometimes people say, well, ancestors want to support us. They actually want to help us. And my experience with dominant culture is that it's conditioned many of us to think when someone transitions, they are no longer, we no longer have a relationship with them. And that's not how I believe it works. They've just transitioned, and they are a transitioned ancestor, not a living ancestor anymore. And actually, my experience with my grandmother when she transitioned was that her ability to support me was much more expansive than it was. And she was wonderful in her, while she was alive on earth, but her ability to be expansive in her support, it was much greater than when she was in her body, because the body is limited in some ways, but the spirit's not. And that's how I think of my grandmother and other ancestors. And so I believe people like her, who I've called in an ongoing relationship with, and she's an ancestor who's been ready to support me, and in fact likely called me back home when she was ready to transition, because I was not supposed to be there, and she was not sick at the time. It happened all of a sudden when she had a stroke and transition. I think that these well ancestors want to show up for us, and it's a matter of us connecting with something we can't see, something we can't hold on to. Like, I can't hug my grandmother in the same way anymore, but I feel her all the time around me. Often, and this is what I wrote in the book, I feel her at the back of my heart. I feel her hand on my back. Sometimes, gently, and sometimes more like pushing me. And I think it's just hard for people to, depending on their experience, to connect with something they can't see. And again, this is like double down on, because of our conditioning. Like, someone passes away, they're gone. I don't believe that. I think their spirit is still present. And of course, yoga tells us this, like, the soul is everlasting. So it's aligned with this practice of yoga for us to believe these spirits are still present. And what I want to work on is calling in the healthy ones, and also to do my healing. And you've named this a few times, because through my healing, I can actually heal back in the line ancestors like my father, who were quite unsettled when they transitioned. And by calling in the well ancestors, I don't have to carry for example, my father's baggage, but I am prioritizing my healing, which can help him heal, and then help him show up for me in a different way as he's transitioned. So that's what I would say about ancestors. There's a lot there.
Those are really good insights, especially what you mentioned about whether if having those close connections to your ancestors through experiences that you've had here on earth, but knowing that their spirit lives, that is that is that is valid. The spirit is everlasting, and you'll never forget how someone made you feel. So that you always have a place in your heart to have space for that person. And again, bringing awareness now and then to that person, to that spirit, to that soul, connects you back to them, even though they're not physically here. Your insight about, even though if someone is gone and they did have baggage, how do you not make that your own baggage, by doing the healing of by doing your own healing, which ultimately heals them, which that's a really beautiful thing. Because if a soul does pass away, who if a person passes away and the soul and the spirit is still um, out there everlasting, but they're still holding that baggage, knowing that your future, or someone is doing the spiritual work for both of you, for you, and connects back to that person. I never thought about it that way. I thought it was just you, but you're actually also releasing that person from that baggage. So thank you. That's a beautiful takeaway, based on what you just shared. I do have two comments here. So this is from Jane. She says, "Hello, thank you for being here today. In addition to all the events in 2020 and 2021, I'm also grieving the losses of 9/11 as we near the 20th anniversary. I worked across the street from the World Trade Center and experienced trauma and witnessed so many tragedies." I just got goosebumps from what you just said too. Just reading that, Jane. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, and I responded in the chat too. That's the other comment that, one, thank you for sharing, Jane. And what I've found in the last 18 months, over the last 18 months, is that this grief time we're in, and the multiple pandemics, amplifies all of the other times that we've experienced collective grief, like 9/11. And of course, your relationship to 9/11 may be different than mine. I wasn't there. I didn't witness it. Of course, I was deeply impacted. I saw it on TV, but I wasn't present in the space. So the trauma is housed in my body in a different way. And I didn't lose anyone in that tragedy. Like that wasn't my experience. And many others did. I have other people in my life who did lose people. And anniversaries are this time when more intense grief can come up too. And you've been named, it's the 20th anniversary. So there's this way we're looking back at that time, and we're also in this time of, we've named it, so much loss and so much uncertainty. So thanks for sharing. And what I invite people into is tending, caring for their heart, as we've been talking about. And it's hard because some of us can be in community and some of us can't, but in whatever ways we can be in community together, in particular people who've had the same experiences you've had, I think that could feel healing if that's how you heal. I think community is one of the ways that we heal, and I think it's how we're going to have to be in space to heal. We're going to need to do it together. So thank you for sharing.
Thank you, Jane. Thanks, Michelle. That's another good point about community. I was just thinking through it as we're processing our own grief and learning how to live, to heal it. It's hard for other people to understand that. Perhaps your specific family, your friends haven't had experiences or haven't gotten to that level of spirituality to really dig deep into to bring awareness. So definitely having that community to open up and to discuss, just like we're doing here, where we're sharing thoughts, experiences, sharing the practices and techniques that Michelle, based on her experiences, help guide us in our hearts and our healing. It's good to continue to work, to go through that journey, and also meet people along the way to support one another. Okay, we have another comment from Chris. Michelle, thank you so much for being here, and happy belated birthday. Happy belated birthday, Michelle. What did the writing of Finding Refuge bring to life for you, particularly after its publication? What is simmering as others are engaging with your work? Great question, Chris. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. And Chris, I'm going to answer your question. I see Coco's question too about ancestors and do they really want to help us, even if they weren't healed. And I want to be specific about this. And you also named Coco the hard time with balance of, the ones that bring shame versus the ones you may feel pride around or that are supportive. The chapter 3 is about my father in Finding Refuge, and he was not settled when he transitioned. And in fact, I had not seen him for 7 years, I think. And I could feel that he wasn't settled. And I also knew that he left this world with regrets. Like he had a lot of regrets. And I didn't have regrets about our relationship, but I could feel that he did in his living, his life on earth. And the moment he transitioned, can feel his energy in that way. And so I didn't ask him to show up and help me. And in fact, when his energy, and this happened with my mom too, he showed up for her multiple times and she was like, I don't want your energy here. And I did that too. I set some boundaries around it because what would show up is unsettled energy. And it would be felt in my space, which feels like a sanctuary to me. And so I'd feel this energy. I'd hear wind chime, which is what I associate with him because they started ringing after he passed away and there was no wind. And I have one in my house and like I'd feel that and hear that. It was stuff like that he was rattled, and he was showing up in that way in my space. And so he transitioned in 2017. It was not until this maybe a month ago that I felt a shift in him. And I felt like, oh, he's showing up differently. And perhaps some of the regret has eased and maybe he's ready to do work. He may not be ready to show up for me and support me, but maybe he's ready to heal is what I felt. And so I don't think all the ancestors who've transitioned are positioned to help us. And I do think they pass on their trauma to us if they haven't worked to resolve it. And that in this lifetime, if we work to resolve our trauma and the ways in which we're grieving, I believe that will have some impact on the ancestors who are unhealed. And if we prioritize this work. So I just wanted to speak to that because I think your question comes up a lot and it's really deep. And we ultimately have to figure out what kind of relationship we want with ancestors. Like we have to figure out what's okay for us and where we need to set boundaries and where we actually feel shame because there was something shameful that happened, right? Or something shameful they did. I think we need to acknowledge that. And I also feel like so much of the trauma that people have perpetuated throughout history is based in their own trauma and based in conditions that didn't allow them to be whole. And so I can hold that. It doesn't mean I always have compassion for people who are self-identified white supremacists, for example, but I can understand that suffering and that comes from trauma, right? And that's part of their lineage as well. And so much of that is about unhealed trauma. And then we decide like how we engage with that, right? We figure out like how much we want to engage in the way I just named. And Chris, your question about, thank you for the birthday wishes. And your question was about what did writing Finding Refuge bring to light for me after its publication? This happened with Skill in Action too, where someone told me, a healer said, when Skill in Action is out in the world, let it be. And she said, just let it go, birth it and let it be. And I'll never forget it because she said, let it do what it's going to do, which I loved. And I feel the same way about Finding Refuge, that I wrote it and it felt like the stories moved through me. And it did feel like deep ancestral shamanic work to create a book like this and to download practices in the way that I did for this book and to talk about heart work in the way I have in Finding Refuge. And once it was done, I was like, I'm going to let it do what it does. And what has been really interesting is that, my intention certainly was to elevate a conversation like the one we're having now about grief and to bring it to the surface and also to expand people's view about grief. So it's not just my individual experience, it is about everyone, and it is about what we're doing to each other. And so what I've noticed is, and Ingrid, we were talking about this before people logged on, that people are sending me responses to the journaling prompts in the book. They're sending me stories about how they're grieving. They're talking about wanting to move through the book slowly, which is what I wanted. And I want people to come back to the practices over and over because they're meant to be lifelong practices. And so it's been sweet to hear how my stories and the stories of my ancestors and the people and energies who helped me write this book. It's been interesting and sweet to see how people are deeply impacted by it and affected by it. And so that's how it feels. And it's also the other thing connected with this is I've been talking about grief for a while related to systemic oppression. And I think finding refuge, it's like a container where we can talk about grief. And so in every space I'm in now, I'm saying something about collective grief, not just because of finding refuge, but because of the moment we're in. And I also am not surprised, but curious about the timing of it coming out. Because the book begins, the introduction is about my like one of my deepest experiences of grief and suffering related to the murder of Trayvon Martin. And it came out on July 13th, which is the day that George Zimmerman was acquitted. It was 8 years later that it came out. The publication date got moved up to July 13th from August 15th. Like these synchronous things happen with the book and continue to happen. So I'm sitting with not only the grief that's here, right, and the heart work, but the magic that's happening because of the medicine contained in this book. And I'm clear it's not just about me. Like it's so much bigger than me. So these are some of the thoughts I have, and of course, there's more that will be revealed throughout time about how this feels and what's percolating inside now that this is in physical form in the world.
Thanks so much, Chris, for your question, and Coco. Michelle, thank you so much. When you referred to Coco's question, you mentioned boundaries, even with ancestors. It's funny because you think of boundaries with people right now that are physically here. So creating those boundaries also is also helpful guidance. And something that, after you answered the question, that made me think too, everybody who's doing these heart healing work, I have to admit it's very it's courageous, and all of you here, great work, because you're actually breaking the cycle of all the trauma or the experiences of those that has left behind, and we're doing that work to release ourselves and our future generations of that, and those that we connect with, as we're all interconnected. So I'm really proud of everyone, and I'm happy that Michelle is sharing all these tools to help us go through the process of doing so. Okay, Chris had a comment. Your description of the feedback landing for you feels so tender. Thank you for sharing all that is rising. Thank you, Chris. Michelle, something that I wanted to ask you that was interesting, based on the Hive chapter, was, are you still a beekeeper?
I am. I love chapter 6 in the book, which is a magic number for bees, because they create hexagons in their hive, these magical creation. It's art what they're creating, but it's also for their survival and sustenance. And so I have 3 hives. 2 are newer, and Sting, who I wrote about in chapter 6, is huge. It's like 30,000 plus bees in that hive now. They're quite prolific. One day I want to write a book about social justice and community and the bees, because if you ever have the opportunity, either in person or online, if you're afraid of honeybees, to watch them work, everything they do is for the hive. They do not see themselves as individual bees. They see themselves as an extension of the hive always, which is what I want us to do, right, as people, and to come back into our humanity in this way of seeing ourselves as an extension of each other and all energies and beings. And you know, they work tirelessly to support the hive, and they're wise about resources, and they split the hive when they've run out of resources, or they anticipate doing that. And so they're amazing to have in this space. And they came to me when my mother was sick. And one thing that people may not know about bees, honeybees, is there's information about honeybees that goes way back in many, many traditions and many spaces across the globe. And there's bee mysticism in many different cultures. And it's in multiple cultures, it's said that honeybees work between realms. So they work between this realm, the earthly realm, and the spiritual realm. So the explanation my friend, who's a beekeeper, gave me when I got these bees, after I believe having a dream about bees, it wasn't planned. She said, because my mother was sick, I think they're here to help your mom transition, which I believe. There's a story in chapter 6 about this. And my mother's here. She didn't transition, but everyone thought she was going to. And so I love the idea of this mysticism around them and magic, that they're working between realms and that they can see something that we don't see. And if you watch a honeybee, they ascend pretty quickly. And it makes me think about these different realms there. And they always come back to the hive, right? What they're doing and what they're working with. So thanks for asking about the bees. I love them, and they're such models for how we need to be toward each other.
Yeah, I really like the story about the bees because it also, it was kind of like an analogy, or we can learn from from one another. We can learn from a bee. We can learn from the hive of how to, so many things that I got from that chapter, but definitely the main takeaway there was about not looking into individual needs, but the collective needs, because we are meant to be as a community. We won't survive as an individual. We have to do the individual work for one another, not just for ourselves. And there was a beautiful analogy with the bees to kind of represent that. I do recommend to the group for sure to check out one of the bee documentaries because it's fascinating. And all this is very inspirational to bring into perspective. So thank you. Coco loves spirit animals, and I try not to let fear block what I feel when I see them appear too. Love how aligned they are with your work on grief. Can you give us the name of a documentary to watch? I think, let me see if I can remember one off the bat. But Michelle, I don't know if you know of any, or a book, because I know there was a really good book on on the hive.
There's oh yes, the book, and then there's
the story about bees.
The book is called The Song of Increase, and it's Song of Increase, listening to the wisdom of honeybees for kinder beekeeping and a better world. It is amazing. It is, this person is an intuitive, but when she began her relationship with bees, they wouldn't really communicate with her, and it took time. Like, she really writes about her relationship and what they shared with her, and I would highly recommend it for anyone, even if you're not a beekeeper. It's just beautifully written. The quote, there's a quote in Finding Refuge from that book about the hive, and then all bees seeing themselves as part of the hive. So The Song of Increase. And then there's a short film called The Good of the Hive. I have to think of some other documentaries. Because I'm a beekeeper, go down like YouTube rabbit holes to figure out what's going on with the bees. So I don't watch as many documentaries about them. But The Good of the Hive is one that's a short film that some of my friends actually worked on. And there are many others about the bees and our relationship with them, and how without the bees, we're not going to have fresh food, right? Like, we're not going to have, because they pollinate. And there are documentaries about bee collapse and why that's happening, and how humans are contributing to that. So I do invite people to, learn more about what's happening and our relationship with the bees, and that we're part of this ecosystem they're part of as well.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Well, just to wrap this up, Michelle, thank you so much for the hours spent with us. It was lovely to meet you, to speak with you, and thank you very much for sharing your work, your experiences, and the tools for us to consider in our own experiences, to keep working and making it a process, process and progress for healing of the heart. Thank you everyone for being on this book club discussion. Appreciate you. Any last remarks, Michelle? Do you want to share any workshops, any talks, anything that you would like to share with the group to keep us up to date to how we can learn more from you, spend time with you, or just continue to receive the information we need for those daily insights?
Yeah, thank you, Ingrid, for the conversation and discussion and thoughtful questions, and everyone for being here, for showing up for this. So my website, which I think is in the chat earlier, is michellecjohnson.com. And it's updated all the time with different workshops. And what's on the website are workshops for skill and action, and book discussions and workshops for finding refuge. So there's a ton there, and there are a lot of different ways to be in community with me. If you're interested, that's the best way to stay updated. And my newsletter as well, which you can connect to through the website. And what I will say is you mentioned skill and action at the beginning. There's a second edition of that coming out in October 26th. It is much more expanded. It's 7 chapters. It has 10 practices. It's based on the first edition, and then my traveling around the world and people asking questions, and my own understanding of how we can be skillful, and of course the times shifting as well that we're living in. And I'm really excited about it. The themes are all the same, but in so many ways it's a new book, because of needing to adapt to the times in which we're living right now. So there's information about that on the website too, if people are interested in that. I'm excited for that to come out in the world. And the final thing I'll say is I have a podcast called Finding Refuge. I just started season 2. Season 1 began August of 2020 and ended in May. And so we just began the second season this month on August 1st. I release 2 episodes a month. I talk to many different people about how they're finding refuge, about grief, about all of the themes in the book. So if you're interested in that and connecting with other people who are perhaps interested in the same things that we've been talking about tonight, I would invite you to take a listen to some of that. And thank you again for being here.
Thank you much for sharing. I just placed it on the chat, the podcast. That's great. Instagram and your website. Just one thing I want to throw out there, because I do want to thank you for this. In skill and action, what you mentioned about how do you introduce yourself, one of the things that you learn in yoga is, who am I? How do I introduce myself? You're not your job, you're not your title, you're not so forth. And I think the exercise that you had was such a great experience. So I do recommend, if you have not read the book yet, please check it out, because it actually empowers you to realize how much special you are, how unique you are, and how those society titles doesn't make you that person. And you're so much richer than that. So thank you so much, because I consider that now every time I introduce myself, how can I apply this in whatever scope I'm in? And that's just one thing that you called out earlier that I did want to mention. So thank you so much. Appreciate everybody. Michelle, have a beautiful week. And I look forward to staying connected with your whereabouts and your future book.
Thank you so much. Take good care.
All right, everybody. Thank you. Have a wonderful week.